The day he'd been left alone in a world colder than a mountain storm. He knew what it meant to lose everything. To be trapped in a silence nobody else could understand. The auctioneer threw his arms in the air and yelled, "Fine! A quarter price. Her keep alone is costing me." But still no one moved. Some laughed nervously. Others spat and muttered that the girl's silence was a curse, that taking her meant inviting Apache vengeance. A few simply didn't want the responsibility of a broken soul. Wyatt exhaled slowly, pushing away from the rail. He wasn't sure whether it was fate, guilt, kindness, or instinct guiding his boots across the dusty yard. But before he knew it, he stood near the front of the crowd. The auctioneer blinked, surprised to see movement. Wyatt pulled off his hat, looked at the girl, not at her bruises, not at the ropes, but at her eyes, and for the first time, her gaze shifted just slightly. Not in fear, not in hope, in recognition. As if she sensed he was carved from a different kind of world than the others. Wyatt lifted his hand. "I'll take her," he said quietly, but the sound carried like thunder. Gasps and murmurs erupted instantly. Cole's gone soft. What's he gonna do with an Apache girl? That ain't wise, Wyatt. The auctioneer, stunned but relieved, slammed his gavel and declared, "Sold! To Wyatt Cole!" Wyatt approached the platform, pulling a pocket knife from his belt. The girl didn't flinch as he gently cut the ropes. When her wrists came free, the marks were deep and red, but she held herself with unwavering dignity. "You're safe now," Wyatt murmured, though he doubted she believed it. She didn't answer, didn't even blink, but her breathing softened slightly, just enough for him to notice. As they stepped off the platform, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the yard. And in those shadows, a handful of silent watchers leaned from the edge of town, men dressed in darker colors, men whose horses carried Apache markings, men whose expressions were carved from stone. Their eyes didn't follow the auctioneer. They didn't follow the crowd. They followed her, the quiet Apache girl, and as Wyatt led her toward his horse, unaware of the storm behind them, the watchers faded into the dusk like spirits from an ancient tale. The story wasn't ending. It was just beginning. Wyatt Cole guided his horse slowly along the narrow trail leading away from Redstone Crossing, the quiet Apache girl walking beside him with a composed but unreadable expression. Though she was free of the auction ropes, the weight of her silence lingered like an invisible chain. The evening breeze rustled the sagebrush, carrying the smell of dust, pine, and distant rain as the sun painted the horizon in fire-red streaks. Wyatt wasn't sure what compelled him to purchase her. He wasn't even sure what future awaited either of them. He only knew one thing. He couldn't leave her there, bound, humiliated, and treated like livestock. As they traveled, the girl finally looked at him, not in fear, not in gratitude, but with a kind of steady consideration, as if trying to read the truth hidden behind his quiet demeanor. Wyatt kept his tone soft. "I'm not gonna hurt you. You're free to walk away if you want." She blinked once, slowly, then turned her eyes back toward the trail ahead. She didn't run, didn't hesitate. She simply walked alongside him, as though she had chosen, at least for the moment, not to face the world alone. They continued for miles until they reached an abandoned rest cabin near the foothills. Wyatt opened the old wooden door, letting the dust settle around them. He motioned for her to enter. She stepped inside cautiously, her movements graceful, feline, and alert. He set down his saddlebag and began preparing a small fire. "My name's Wyatt," he said finally. The girl remained silent, sitting cross-legged near the fire, her fingers tracing the embroidered beads on her dress, perhaps a reminder of home, a reminder of who she had been before fate had shredded her world. Wyatt studied her quietly. She was brave, not broken. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was protection. And deep inside, he sensed she held stories more painful than bullet wounds. As the fire crackled, Wyatt tore a piece of bread in half and handed it to her. She accepted it slowly, nodding once, not as a gesture of submission but acknowledgement. Hours passed and night settled. Wyatt sat near the entrance, keeping watch. He didn't see the shadow slipping between the trees until the girl suddenly stood, her posture sharp and alert, her eyes flashing with the first real emotion he had seen. A warning. Wyatt reached for his revolver just as three silhouettes emerged from the darkness, weapons drawn, faces painted with Apache markings and grief. But these were not captors. They were her people. The girl stepped forward slowly, her breathing heavy, her hands trembling, not in fear but in recognition. One of the Apache men, older and hardened by war, bowed his head. He spoke in a low, melodic tone, and though Wyatt didn't understand the language, the weight of sorrow was unmistakable. The girl approached him and touched his arm, her eyes softening. Wyatt could feel the emotion pulsing in the air, the reunion of scattered lives. But then the older warrior looked at Wyatt, long, deep, and searching. The meaning was clear. Why did you help her? Why is she alive in your presence? Wyatt lowered his gun and lifted his hand slightly. I didn't buy her to own her, he said firmly. I bought her to save her. The Apache warrior studied him for a long moment, then spoke again, softer this time, his tone shifting from suspicion to measured respect. The girl finally stepped back toward Wyatt, placing herself slightly between him and the others, not in defiance, but in unexpected loyalty. One of the younger warriors frowned and whispered sharply at her. She shook her head, firm, calm, decisive. For the first time, Wyatt realized she had chosen to stay by his side. The elder Apache nodded slowly, accepting her choice, though it clearly pained him. He stepped forward, placed his hand over his heart, and spoke her name aloud. The first time Wyatt had ever heard, it was Ayana, a name that meant eternal blossom, a life meant to bloom again after the harshest winter. The Apache group melted back into the darkness, but not before leaving a final message. The people would watch her from afar, protect her from shadows, and judge Wyatt's intentions until proven true. When the night returned to stillness, Ayana sat near the fire once more. Wyatt approached cautiously. Ayana, he said, testing the weight of her name. For the first time her lips parted, and in a barely audible whisper she replied, Wyatt. Her voice was soft as snowfall, fragile from disuse, but the sound cracked his chest wide open. Trust, a beginning, a fragile bond forged in dust, danger, and unexpected mercy. Days passed, and Wyatt and Ayana traveled together across the frontier. She helped him mend fences, gather wood, and navigate the terrain with instincts he could never match. He never asked her to work, she simply chose to. And slowly her silence faded. One evening, while watching the sunset paint the plains in gold, she spoke more freely. You changed my path, she whispered. Wyatt shook his head gently. No, you changed your own. I just refused to let the world swallow you. Ayana smiled faintly, the first real smile he had seen, but danger still lingered. Word had spread that Wyatt Cole had taken an Apache girl from the block. Outlaws, bounty hunters, and men with darker intentions were starting to whisper his name in saloons. One night, as Wyatt and Ayana rested near a creek, a familiar rustle of horses drew near. A group of 5 armed men dismounted, the leader stepping forward with a smug grin. We heard you bought yourself a little prize, Cole, the man taunted. Wyatt stood tall, his hand hovering near his gun. But before he could draw, Ayana was already behind him, steady and fearless. The men advanced until arrows whistled through the air like falcons diving. The Apache watchers had returned, silent and deadly. Within seconds, the outlaws were disarmed and fleeing. The elder warrior appeared from the tree line, nodded once at Ayana, then vanished again. Wyatt exhaled deeply. Ayana placed her hand gently on his arm, grounding him. The world was changing. She was no longer a prisoner of silence, and he was no longer a lone wanderer. They had become something else, something unspoken yet powerful. As they continued toward the sunrise, Ayana said softly, You stepped forward when no one else did. Wyatt glanced at her, smiled faintly, and replied, And I'd do it again. Their journey had just begun, a tale of redemption, courage, and a bond born from the ashes of suffering and the promise of hope. The sun hung low above the dusty auction yard of Redstone.